All right, so welcome to tonight's class on the 1960s. Today we'll be discussing really sort of, or at least what I'm going to try and do is put the context of this period into, try and get rid of some of the sort of nostalgia of the period, right? Hippies and Woodstock and all, and that will certainly play a part of it. What I'm going to really try and talk about here are sort of why do we get these cultural movements that flourish in the 1960s that we were so familiar with, um, and then talk about sort of what is it that makes this period the period that we all sort of come to idealize years later. So, the 1960s, consumerism, fear, revolution, and of course, music. So, when we start thinking about the 1960s, it is important for us to see that there's a lot going on in this period. There's a lot that is certainly evolving, and there's certainly a lot that people are really concerned with. So by the 1960s, if we started it with 1959, right, the the Cold War is in full effect, right? The Cold War is really really almost at its peak, right? If we start with the early 1950s, you have the beginning of the Korean conflict in 1950 to 53, which we talked about last week. If you look at 19 um, if you look at like the 1959 Cuban Revolution, which brings in Fidel Castro and communism right off the coast of the United States in southern, off of Miami, right, 90 miles off Miami. Or if you bring in like the Vietnam War starting in the 1960s, right? All of these things lead to a really big concern that the end is near, as it were, and communism and was really going to take over the whole world. When you mix that with this rising population, we talk a lot today about the boomer population, right? The baby boomers. By the 1960s, right, the boomers are coming of age. If let's say if the boomer generation starts in the late 1940s, by 1963, they're 16, 17. They're getting their first jobs. So that there's this new group of people who are um, coming of age and having cash in their pocket, and really a new group of people that we need to start talking about. Consumerism is a thing, sort of coupled with that, and I'll show you how that happens in a few moments. And then obviously, we have national self determination. These countries that were once for so long colonies and others are now looking to get their independence, and they're looking to sort of exercise their own privileges. So consumerism and the baby boom, these two phenomena really come together in the 1960s. So let's talk a little bit about consumerism, and then we'll talk a little bit about the baby boom. So we've talked a lot about consumerism in the 1920s. We talked about the growing demand for products, cars, refrigerators, houses. One of the things we talked about very briefly a couple of weeks ago was the growing demand for um, houses and things in the wake of World War II. When we mix this in with the baby boomer age, what you have is this new group of people, young people, who are again, late teens, early 20s, I guess at the latest in the early 1960s, but certainly by 1968, right? If they were born in 1948, now they're 20 years old. They have a bit more money. They're going to school. They're really starting to become a new power block, and things are starting to be marketed to them, right? So Twiggy is probably the most famous, real supermodel of the age, right? Really the first supermodel, I suppose, who a lot of people began to think about as the first supermodel. And all of these things really, again, are starting to be targeted to young people. And then you mix that with the consumerism, right? So I'm sure you all know the clothing company, The Gap, right? Why do we call it The Gap? It's because it's formed in 1968, which is why one of the brands of jeans they have is called the 1968 jean. What's the Gap? They're The Gap. They are not the older generation. They're not their parents, but they're also not their younger siblings. So they are The Gap. And that's what the clothes is marketed for. So you have this new group of people that are becoming groups of consumers. They're becoming people that are really being targeted for marketing. And then obviously, what is the baby boom? The baby boom is a phenomenon that happens after World War II, right? So World War II ends in 1945, which we discussed a couple of weeks ago. And when World War II ends, you have all those GIs coming home, but they are groups of people now who have a bit more cash in their pocket, whether that's because of post-war prosperity, the GI Bill, whatever the case might have been. They have a bit more security than they would have had earlier. So they start to have more children. So there's, if you look back at this previous chart, right? So from 1945 through to about 1965 or so, you have a huge spike in the number of births, right? Certainly that happens, I suppose, with the beginning of prosperity in the 1940s. But once World War II ends in 1945, you start to see a lot more births, peaking in 1947. All those GIs coming home. And then obviously it doesn't necessarily tailor off until the 1980s, right? And you can see 1970s. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks, but there's a recession in the 1970s causing that dip. Anyway, so what then is consumerism? Consumerism is a phenomenon that happens because more people have more money in their pocket. More people have these better jobs, GI Bills, all these things. People can start to buy things that they've wanted for so long. Again, you have those kids, those baby boomer generation. There's a lot of them. And they start to develop a demand for cars and jeans and clothes and music. And again, things can be tailored specifically to them. They're the people who can start really affording luxuries, right? Maybe some of them still live at home, but they have their first jobs and they have extra cash in their pocket that they can burn on, again, new clothing, new things like that. Along with this is you also have the suburbanization, right? Which also helps with the cars, right? So one of the things that happens in this post World War II age is that people start to develop a demand for houses, right? People can get cheaper loans. The Federal Housing Authority establishes the 30-year loan, the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, which had not happened before this. And what happens as a result of that is you get a boom in home purchases. And in particular, you have Abraham Levitt. So Abraham Levitt is a real estate developer based I believe based here in New York. But he and his son, Abraham Levitt and son, wind up building homes, right? So they use the sort of industrial scale model that had become popular in car manufacturing and refrigerator manufacturing, and they basically do the same thing for houses. So that's why you have 3 Levittowns here in the Northeast, right? You have Levittown, Long Island, about 35 minutes east of Queens, where I live in. Or you have Levittown, New Jersey, which is outside of Princeton, Trenton area. And then you have Levittown, Pennsylvania, which is outside of Philadelphia. And these 3 suburban areas are part of this new growing consumerism, right? People can start to move. They buy houses that are relatively cheap. They have their own plot of land. So these become homes for working class people. Now, there's a couple of pieces to that, right? This also helps consumerism, right? Because once you've moved from an apartment to a house, now you need a refrigerator, or new refrigerator, you need a washing machine, you need a vacuum cleaner. It helps people start to buy things. But even more importantly, I think for the auto industry, is you also need a car, right? This is, if you're going to live in the suburbs, you need a car. You can't just rely on, if you're like, if you move from a city to a suburb, in the city you have stores on your corner, you have local shops. In a suburb, particularly in the 1960s, as this is being developed, that may not be the case. So you need a car. And then again, helps the auto industry, helps jobs, consumerism. And for young people, again, if we go back to the baby boom, You have young kids who are having cash in their pocket, living at home, and the car becomes their first real big purchase. So again, if you think back to like Greece, right? Everybody's got the hot rod or whatever it is, right? People are starting to buy those things, and again, the suburbs help that. One of the things we're going to be talking about in a few moments is the new racial divide that emerges in the 19 or at least new racial consciousness that begins in the 1960s. And for the suburbs, a lot of this is founded in this period, right? Levittown, and this will not be a large portion of what we're going to discuss later, but I just want to point out Levittown, the Levittowns, the three of them, because they were privately developed areas by a private company, they had some really strict race laws. African Americans were not allowed to buy homes in any of the Levittowns. And there was severe discrimination. Again, even though African Americans began having more cash, they were part of this growing consumerism. They were part of this growing economic abilities. There was this new, they're not new, I shouldn't say. There was these renewed, in many ways, racial tensions, and consumerism, and I'm sorry, suburbs certainly played into this. Sometimes we call the suburbs in this period the Great White Flight. People, white people moving from the cities into suburbs to avoid race mixing. So again, that plays into this larger part. So when we couple the baby boom with the rise in consumerism, we start targeting things to younger people. Again, if we look back at that chart that I had up a few moments ago, right? So if in 1947, 25 births per thousand, which it says here on the y-axis, right? 25 births per thousand. That's 2.5 births per 100 people. So you're talking, a lot of babies being born. So if you move that now to 20 years later, 1967, or even 18 years later, 1965, what you've got is a growing group of people for whom things can be marketed, or to whom things can be marketed. So you have a rising group of people who are, again, cash in their pocket, targeted popularity. So you have things like the miniskirt coming around, targeted at young ladies, being different from their mothers. Or obviously, when it comes to music, pointed music references. You have the Beatles, right? And if you think of any of the things about the Beatles from the 1960s, right, when they come to Shea Stadium, the British invasion, as it's called, right, whether it's the Beatles, the Monkees, the Rolling Stones, any of those bands, they are targeted specifically to young people. And that's huge. And then obviously Elvis, although Elvis is a little bit earlier, let's say, probably in the late 1950s, but it's certainly by the early 60s, he's certainly part of this as well. Rock and roll in general, whether that's Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, excuse me, any of those are exactly part of this. And then obviously once you have the growth in music, you also obviously have a counterculture that emerges with this. And obviously probably the most famous example of this is Woodstock in 1968, August of 1968. However, any of that can certainly be true for, the Summer of Love, 1966, Altamont Speedway, 1969. All of those things are part of this growing counterculture, right? Again, people have money in their pockets. They want to be able to sort of set themselves apart, diverge a little bit, and that's where these cultures come in. But again, this is sort of taken to an extreme, right? You have people in Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco, listening to the Grateful Dead, but not having a job. And, it sort of becomes a little bit crazier.